Good evening and welcome, everybody. My name is Graham Furness, and I'm the Pro-Director for Research at SOAS. And I'd like to welcome you all in the audience tonight, particularly those of you who have traveled a very long way to be here, and to also Professor Gilbert, Achcar's friends and colleagues who are here. We have guests from many different institutions here tonight, and we really appreciate your presence with us. It all adds to the occasion that is a SOAS inaugural. It's a ceremony, a rite de passage for the speaker, a celebration for all of us, and an enjoyable intellectual event for the whole SOAS community. And to make sure it is an enjoyable event, I do need to do a little bit of simple housekeeping at the beginning. So please, can I ask you to make sure that your mobile phones are on silent or turned off? And also please note where the fire exits are. I'm very pleased indeed to preside over this inaugural lecture, which is the second of the 2012-2013 inaugural lecture series. I think it's going to be really interesting. Gilbert Achcar joined SOAS as Professor of Development Studies and International Relations in 2007. Before London, he taught or researched in Beirut, in Paris, in Berlin. It was a real coup for SOAS when Gilbert was persuaded to move here, and he has continued to be a fine teacher, a great scholar, and a public intellectual, making a wide range of contributions. Like all of us here, I'm greatly looking forward to being enlightened about development and revolution, the roots of the Arab uprising. Professor Alex Kalina will introduce Professor Achcar tonight. He studied PPE at Balliol College, Oxford, and philosophy of science at the London School of Economics before writing a DPhil on Marx's Capital, also at Balliol. He was a junior research fellow in contemporary social thought at St. Peter's College, Oxford in 1979 to 81, after which he taught social and political theory at the Department of Politics at the University of York until 2005, when he moved to King's. Alex Kalina has been an active contributor to the development of the movement for another globalization, participating in the World Social Forum and an animator of the European Social Forum. The vote of thanks after Gilbert Achcar will be given by Professor Denise Candiotti, who is very well known to all of us here at SOAS. Professor Candiotti was educated in the social psychology department at LSE, and she's had a very interesting career doing work first on political economy and rural transformation, and then gender, nationalism, and Islam. From 1969 until 1980, Denise worked at Istanbul Technical University and Bogazici University in Turkey, but then moved to England, finally taking up a position at SOAS in 1992. Denise has been a tower of strength at SOAS. She has been key to the development of our expertise in Central Asia and has played an important role in developing the next generation of scholars in that field. We are very grateful indeed to both of them for being part of today's event. Finally, you will be invited next door to a reception for some wine and canapés at the end. To introduce Professor Achcar, I will now pass over to Professor Alex Kalina.
I feel very honored speaking here today to introduce Gilbert Achcar in his inaugural lecture. I think we've known each other for something over 20 years, and we first met not in an academic but in a political context. We first met after we'd been campaigning against the US-led coalition's war against Iraq in 1991. Gilbert campaigning in France and I in Britain. And I think when we met, I think we would have been surprised to know that we would end up as respectable professors at London University as we are today. taking part in such an august ceremony. I think, looking back at that time, I think Gilbert understood probably better than I did that what happened in the Gulf in 1991 was simply the first stage in the assertion of imperial military power in the Middle East in a much more direct way than previously had been the case. And indeed, one of the main themes of Gilbert's research from his doctorate onwards has been to analyze the roots and dynamics of the American empire, of the imperialism of the United States. His doctoral thesis was on the subject of empire and money. Pretty good subject now as then. And it's a subject that I've also sought to study, and I was very happy a couple of years ago to be able to publish a review that Gilbert wrote of my own book on imperialism, which subjected it to friendly but remorseless critique. That's true friendship, as I think I wrote to him at the time. Maybe I should have mentioned earlier that another thing that we have in common, we have a surprisingly large number of things in common. We were both born in Africa, for example. Another thing that we have in common is that we're both Marxists. And one of the things about Marxism is that what has become one of the great words of the contemporary academy, interdisciplinarity, is built into Marxism as an intellectual project. Marxism is an intellectual enterprise that seeks to understand society as a historically developing totality, and therefore it's something that disdains disciplinary boundaries. And one can see that very clearly in Gilbert's work, in his continuing work on imperialism, in all the research that he's undertaken, for example, while he was at Berlin, into the subject of class in contemporary capitalist society. Gilbert is a scholar who's worked in a whole number of different areas, but nevertheless, I think it's fair to say that at the focus of his intellectual contribution has been the drive to develop an intellectually coherent and historically rooted Marxist understanding of the Middle East. And I could refer to many works that Gilbert has written over the years that have been a contribution to this enterprise, but I want to focus on one really outstanding work, which is his book, Arabs and the Holocaust, which was published, I think, more or less simultaneously in French and in English in 2010. I say this not as a friend, I say this trying to make as an objective a judgment as possible, that this is an absolutely brilliant work that examines the Arab world on this most sensitive and politically charged of issues using the tools of scientific historical analysis. And maybe it's worth saying in this context that very often objectivity and neutrality are confused, and they're actually significantly different concepts. Objectivity is the attempt to develop a scientifically based understanding of a phenomenon, but the attempt to do so can be the opposite of neutral in a political or ideological sense. Pierre Bourdieu, someone who Gilbert has also studied and engaged in dialogue with, put forward the idea of committed scholarship a few years ago. And that's precisely the kind of scholarship that Gilbert pursues in this book. And it's an extraordinary work because looking at the historically evolving debates about Nazism and the Holocaust in the Arab world over the decades, what Gilbert does is to reveal a range of political and moral responses to the Holocaust that don't reproduce the kind of spectrum of responses that we found in the West, for example. most obviously because of the presence of different forms of what I persist in calling Islamism, but which Gilbert equally insists on calling Islamic fundamentalism, but nevertheless a spectrum, a range of responses, a range of debates that are a world away from the Orientalist and Islamophobic constructions of the so-called Arab mind that are so common. It's a great work of critical scholarship that comes with a very powerful moral charge. And maybe I feel particularly the need for such scholarship at the present moment. I've been particularly struck by a couple of pieces that have appeared in the Jerusalem Post over the past few days. An op-ed article by Gilad Sharon, son of the former Prime Minister, arguing that Israel should flatten Gaza in the way in which the US flattened Japan in the latter phases of the Second World War. What can one say about such a text and its insensitivity to moral issues, its moral barbarism, is then juxtaposed to another article which reported on the alarming effects of the missile sirens on pets in southern Israel. Given that kind of debased range of political responses to the latest war in the region from which, despite his African origins, I think Gilbert would most strongly identify with, namely the Middle East, the kind of scholarship that Gilbert does is extraordinarily important. And his book should have prepared us from what has emerged with the Arab revolutions, the heteroglossia, the diversity of different and distinctive voices, all in their different ways, articulating the aspiration of peoples assuming control over their own destiny. And the new era that we live in today, the era of the Arab revolutions, revolutions that have had very powerful echoes all over the world and quite unexpected forms of imitation and emulation. This era of the Arab revolutions is the time that Gilbert was really made to interpret. And I think we're extraordinarily lucky that he finds the vantage point from which to view what is happening in the Arab world to be London, and that therefore we're able to benefit from his presence here, as we are in the lecture that he's about to give. So I'd like to introduce Gilbert Achcar to you.
Good evening to all, and it's really extremely embarrassing to speak after having been presented so kindly by Graham first and then by Alex. And by the way, my publisher missed a great opportunity to sell the book had they known that you would be so enthusiastic in presenting it. It's really extremely kind of you, very, very generous. Thank you very much. Alex, thank you, Graham, and thank you, Denise, for having accepted to be here, and thank you all for coming here. Actually, we moved to this room. It's darker in some sense, but it also feels more intimate, actually, than having us packing the Brunei gallery. So that's nice. Unfortunately, we don't have discussions after the inaugurals. That would have been nice, but that's the rule. Well, I mean, I want also to mention the fact that I'm really happy to be at SOAS. I feel very much at home at SOAS, and I felt very much at home at SOAS from the start, because SOAS is undoubtedly one of the most cosmopolitan institutions, academic institutions, at least, I mean, not at least, because beyond the Western world, you won't find many cosmopolitan teaching institutions. So that's definitely one of the most cosmopolitan teaching institutions in the world. And as a cosmopolitan, born in Africa, in Senegal, raised in, growing up in Lebanon, having lived in France for many years and in Germany, and then here, I really feel, very, very much at home. And it's a real pleasure to be with the kind of colleagues and the students that we have here at SOAS. Now, I've been asked what is this lecture inaugurating? And it's a really embarrassing question because I've been here for over 5 years. It's my 6th year. So I guess that, I hope at least that, or at least I may pretend that I'm inaugurating inaugural lectures without gowns. Is this right? Is it the first one? So that might be something that I'm really inaugurating. Other than that, someone suggested that these lectures should be called professorial lectures, which I would find a good suggestion. In any case, the lecture that I'm presenting actually is also in some respects, if ever you Google or whatever, it may seem not entirely new because I have been giving talks on the same topic, the roots of the Arab uprising, in several places since 2011, including Stanford University, Columbia, LSE, Trinity College in Dublin, recently the Collège de France in Paris. So given us a real series of lectures on the same topic. But this was a work in process, and this work is for me now completed in the sense that this lecture is based on my forthcoming book, which should come maybe in June or July of next year, and therefore, I have just finished the manuscript just a few days ago. So I'm now presenting something which is no longer a work in progress, but the result of a research. And of course, I'll here be focusing much more narrowly on one crucial, of course, aspect of the problem, much more narrowly than in the previous lectures that have been given here and there, which were much more encompassing in dealing with the issue from all the various angles. And the fact is that in any case, the Arab uprising is definitely the most appropriate topic for me to deal with in light of the ongoing events, and certainly in judging by the high number of you here, this is something which is, of course, what people are interested in listening to. Now, I will be dealing with that, as I said, with a narrower focus than in my previous talks here and there, which is by narrowing the focus on the aspect that is connected to the department in which I teach, which is development studies. And so hence the title, Development and Revolution. This lecture is based on sections of the first 2 chapters of my forthcoming book, which includes 6 chapters. Of course, such lectures, you have constraints of time and also the format of any oral lecture. This will mean that, of course, I won't be able to get into all the nuances and details pertaining to the issues that I will tackle here. But all these is discussed in the forthcoming book for anyone interested in that. So the Arab uprising, the reason for the roots in the title is that I'm trying to discuss the basic reason, the causes for the uprising. And as you know, various interpretations have been given of these causes, of these reasons. Probably the most widespread kind of interpretation that you found, especially during the initial phase, one should say, of the uprising, was to connect it to the democratic aspiration, which, of course, is correct. This is definitely a very important dimension of everything that happened. I mean, restricting the movement, the uprising, to this dimension, plus a cultural dimension, which was also connected to the description of what was happening as a Facebook revolution. You are very much familiar with that, because that was very much central in the media coverage of the events. And of course, this was a kind of projection or kind of wishful thinking about the real dynamics of the movement, the kind of projection that you will find in, for instance, Barack Obama's speech after the resignation of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. And the kind of expectations that were built on the uprising out of this kind of vision were disappointed with the events, the turn of events since then, and to the point of getting into what I would call a melancholic depression, with the expressions of a lot of disappointment. You have a recent article in the New York Review of Books, which is titled, "This is not a revolution." You have a lot of comments of this kind, if not straight rejections or condemnations of what is going on, like phrases like Islamist winter and so on. Now, basically, I mean, to have interpreted the uprising only as the outcome of these changes, and again, I'm saying I'm not denying that these aspects, and I will be mentioning other aspects which definitely play some role in the events, but are not, in my view, the most central or the deep-rooted cause of the whole uprising. The fact is that oppression has existed in the region for many, many decades, unfortunately, and it hasn't been qualitatively different in recent years, and therefore we can't just, by pointing to oppression, explain why you have now a generalized uprising in the region. Something must have been building up, turning the situation into one that the populations could not tolerate any longer. Another explanation is, and it's connected to the one I mentioned, especially the Facebook dimension, is the youth factor. And again, of course, the youth, I mean, like any revolution, there are not so many senior revolutions or gray revolutions, even if the concept exists. So, of course, the youth was the main moving force in the whole uprising. But, and actually, well, I guess I have to use that here. Yeah. You hear a very often repeated cliché that, oh, this region, I mean, in this region, the majority of the people are under 30, for instance. Well, the fact is that it is true, but it is true of all developing regions in Asia and Africa, with the exception of East Asia. As you can see here, so there's nothing, I mean, this is not a specific feature of the Middle East and North Africa to have a majority of people under 30. And if you look at the proportion of people between 15 and 29, that is this youth, which is the most dynamic section of societies, it is the same across these regions, and there is nothing peculiar about the Middle East and North Africa from that angle. And by the way, since I'm starting to show you a few slides, they speak of the Middle East and North Africa, which covers basically the Arab states plus Iran, but that's the way international institutions define regions. And the source of the data I used to produce the graphs that you are seeing and will be seeing is these international institutions like the World Bank or the ILO and the like. A third explanation that has been given is the 2007-2008 jump in food prices, which actually has been discussed by one of my colleagues here in one inaugural lecture last year. But again here, the fact is that the Arab governments have taken important measures to mitigate the effects of the food crisis and ease social tensions. Before the fall in prices in 2008, of course, again, this played undoubtedly a role, especially in countries like Yemen or Egypt, in heightening the social tensions. That's certain. But, I mean, it's not, again, an explanation in itself. Sub-Saharan Africa had inflation rates quite higher than the MENA region in the 2 years preceding the explosion. In 2009 and 2010, the rates of inflation for Sub-Saharan Africa were 10.6% and 7.4%, whereas in MENA, they were 6.6% and 6.9%, so lower than what you got there. And yet, we haven't seen a comparable uprising in Sub-Saharan Africa. So in short, I mean, we cannot make the higher food prices the determining cause of the upheaval in the Arab world, just as we cannot say, for instance, or we cannot simply, for instance, attribute the popular uprising in Syria to the exceptional droughts that plagued the country, especially between 2006 and 2011. In all these cases, I think it would be to confuse, in such cases, an aggravating circumstance with an efficient cause. Food prices, year of drought in Syria are aggravating circumstances, but they are not the efficient cause for the explosion, for the uprising. In other words, this would be confusing between structure and conjuncture, to borrow the terms of French historian the historian of the French Revolution, who is French, Albert Soboul. This distinction between structural causes and conjunctural causes is very important. A fourth range of explanations link what is happening in the region with the global crisis, the Great Recession, as it has been called, the post-2000 Great Recession. Well, the fact here again is that this region we are discussing, MENA, has suffered less from the global crisis than other regions of the Afro-Asian group. As a World Bank report put it in January 2011, just at the time when it was beginning in the region, the developing countries of the Middle East and North Africa region were less affected than other developing regions by the global recession, in part because of the region's limited financial integration, but also due to its export mix, which is concentrated in products, oil, materials, and light manufactures that were not as sharply affected by the crisis as capital goods, and in turn as the economies which produced them. A fifth range of reasons is more structural in some way. It is to present what is happening as the product of neoliberalism. Now, this explanation itself is vitiated in some way by the contrast between the region's poor economic performance and the good performances of other developing countries, such as Chile or India or Turkey, which have applied neoliberal prescriptions more consistently than the region we are dealing with. And as you know, as at least the students of my department know, for several years now, the international financial institutions have themselves been willing to concede that the results of their Washington consensus, whatever new label or name they use, or these recipes, the results depend on those charged with carrying them out. So they have revised their doctrine and made room for the notion of good governance, as they call it, said to be a condition for the proper functioning of their economic model. Well, conveniently, this allows them to keep peddling the same neoliberal prescriptions in blithe disregard of social political context, while declining all responsibility for the consequences that adopting them has often had and continues to have. And thus, what you see is an exercise in simplistic thinking, which inverts the explanation of the crisis as an effect of neoliberalism into a product of insufficient economic liberalization, which can only be solved if the economies of the region liberalize still more. Let me mention in this regard the the amazing neoliberal complacency of Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto, again well known to the students of my department, who claimed that Mohamed Bouazizi, you know, the young man who set himself on fire in Sidi Bouzid in central Tunisia on 17 December 2010, and who touching off the whole revolutionary process which spread to the whole Arab region. According to De Soto, Bouazizi sacrificed himself for the cause of the free market. I'm not kidding you. According to De Soto, and here I'm quoting, the forces of the market have come to the Arab world, even if governments didn't invite them in. Political leaders must realize that since Bouazizi went up in flames and his peers rose in protest, poor Arabs are no longer outside but inside, in the market, right next to them. It's absolutely extraordinary to read such a description of events. Now, the common observation, even with such, with the international institutions or such neoliberal ideologues, is of course the deep economic problem that Arab countries have been facing for quite a long time, If we look at as an indicator of that, the rate of growth of the GDP, the gross domestic product per capita in the region, as you can see here, and unfortunately I don't have this here, so it's, well, it's not the most convenient to have a laptop, but as you, I don't have to put my glasses. So anyhow, as you can see here, the figures for MENA in the center, this is over 20 years, 40 years. So the first 20 years, the 70s and 80s, you even had, as an average annual rate, a negative one for the region, and you compare with the rest of the developing countries or rest of Asian and African regions. And in the next 20 years, it has been positive, but quite low, at barely 1/2 of the average of developing countries, quite below South Asia, not to mention East Asia. And this chronic problem, as we can see it, this chronic problem of growth is something that here really distinguishes this part of the world compared to the rest of these regions. And it is not, one may suspect that it is related to oil prices, to the fluctuation in oil prices, because undoubtedly when you say GDP for the region, given the importance of oil as in the region, this plays a major role. But it is not the case, because the fluctuation over this period does not explain in and by itself any of the figures here. And to illustrate that, you can see this period, which I've chosen, this 2000-2008 period, which is one of sharp rise in the oil price and until the crisis. And you can see that the average annual growth rate of MENA is even below that of sub-Saharan Africa, despite this very sharp rise in oil prices during this period. The other explanation that one may suspect is the demographic growth rates. And again, it does not explain that. It's true that until the 80s, The region had a very high demographic expansion rate, but this has stopped, I mean, this increase and stabilized at levels which are quite comparable to other developing regions. So again, this does not explain what we have seen. And this economic problem, this lack of growth, this very low growth per capita and even in absolute, has of course a major social consequence, and that's how the economy affects society and then politics. It is, of course, and as you guessed, unemployment. And the region has been for decades actually beating world records in unemployment. As you can see from these figures here, we have had in the MENA region the highest rates of unemployment in the world for several decades now, and quite above the rest of the developing world. And when we take even a closer look at this unemployment, we'll see, and there the record is even much more striking. It is, to a very large extent, a youth unemployment. And as you can see here, the gap between Middle East and North Africa and the rest of Asian and African countries is even much bigger when it comes to youth than it is for the general population. Of course, another even higher gap concerning unemployment is female unemployment in the region. And here the Middle East and North Africa are very high, very far above the rest of the world. But actually what is still more striking than unemployment when it comes to especially the gender dimension, the sex dimension here, is the very low employment to population rate for women in the region. And here a set of reasons are involved, including cultural reasons, which I don't have time to discuss and develop, but just pointing to them. Now, among youth unemployment, because we have seen, we have mentioned the role of the youth in all what happened, a striking feature of the region is the importance of graduate unemployment. And when I mean graduate, when I say graduate, it's of course tertiary education. And this is related to a high rate of enrollment in tertiary education in many countries in the region. And in any case, even in countries where this rate of enrollment, like in Morocco here, is not very high, it's not high, what you have in common everywhere is the high proportion of graduates among the unemployed. They constitute a very important section of the unemployed in all the countries of the region, and this bears direct consequences, of course, as you may understand, for what we are discussing. And what has been also happening over the last years, the last decades, is a very rapid increase over the years with the effect of the democratization of higher education, of education in general, and higher education, starting in the 60s, produced results which led to this increasing graduate proportion of the unemployed, as you can see from these examples on these slides. So overall, what we have had is indeed a declining rate of growth since the 70s. Since the time when the region moved like, or before actually the rest of the world. In some way, the region has been a forerunner of the neoliberal turn in countries like Egypt and the rest. You have had the infitah, as it was called, the opening in Egypt and other countries. So economic liberalization, dismantling of the previous developmentalist, state capitalist kind of system that existed, and with the idea that this will overcome the crisis that gripped the system, the previous system, and lead to some accelerated growth. And the result is here. It's actually a declining linear trend, which is quite clear. Of course, some of the fluctuations here, like the 80s, are due to the oil, the so-called oil glut. But overall, this is a very low rate of growth, as we have seen when you compare it to other parts of the world. So, I mean, I think we are, in my view, undoubtedly confronted here, unquestionably confronted here, with this uprising, with a typical illustration of Marx's famous thesis from his 1859 preface to a contribution to the critique of political economy. And I read, at a certain stage of development, the material productive forces of society come into conflict with the existing relations of production. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an era of social revolution. I think we have a vivid illustration of that here. However, the Arab crisis cannot by itself be regarded, of course, as a manifestation of a general blockage of the capitalist mode of production, if we are speaking in terms of generic mode of production. Nor even, since capitalism continues to generate development in other peripheral zones, nor even a blockage confined to the capitalist periphery. Indeed, even if the crisis currently plaguing the highly developed economies, especially Europe here, eventually proves to be the expression of an insurmountable blockage leading to social political upheaval, even then, the coincidence of this crisis with that rocking the Arab region can hardly be interpreted in terms of cause and effect. To the extent that the crisis in the Arab countries is clearly limited to these countries, to these areas, as far as its peculiar modalities are concerned, it plainly shows that specific factors are at work. It's neither a symptom of the crisis of globalized capitalism in general, nor even a symptom of the crisis of neoliberalism, the dominant management mode in the current phase of capitalist globalization. My contention is that we must derive from Marx's paradigmatic thesis on revolution variants that are less sweeping in historical scope. Development of the productive forces can be stalled not by the relations of production that are constitutive of a generic, ideal typical, if you want, mode of production, such as the relations between capital and wage labor for the capitalist mode of production, but instead by a specific modality of that generic mode of production. There exist situations in which the development of the productive forces is held back either by a simple crisis, a simple between quote marks, crisis in regulation or management mode, in which case a change in the mode of regulation can overcome the crisis from the point of view of the interest of capital, of course, or by a particular type of social domination, one sustaining a specific variant of the generic mode of production. In the former case, as I just said, a change in the mode of regulation may do. In the latter case, the blockage can be overcome only if the dominant social group is overthrown. That is, only by a social revolution. Now let us take a closer look on the conditions for a solution to the crisis of Arab economies. When you have a lack of growth, there's usually not much mystery. It is related usually to a declining, to a low investment rate. And the measurement here is through the rate of investment to GDP, the rate of gross fixed capital formation, which is construction, transport, infrastructure, and industrial equipment. And if you compare here the blue line, which is the MENA, with the other regions, you see that the region has been, beaten here by, I mean, the contrast with East Asia, which is here in green, and even South Asia after after the point when they separate, and the gap starts getting wider and wider. Of course, you have the effect of the crisis of 2007 to 2008, the Great Recession, but this gap has been widening. So we can see that the investment rate, and it also has a slight declining trend for the region, is lower than in other regions. And let us take a closer look at this investment rate and its components, public and private sectors. But before that, just to confirm what I've just been saying about the increasing gap, if you look at the annual growth of gross capital formation, you see how the gap with South Asia and East Asia can but increase because of these differences in the growth. So let us take the closer look, as I said. And here is the public sector. And what is, most striking here, of course, is the green line, which is East Asia. And as you can see, East Asia has a very high public investment rate. And this indicates the state's major role in this region, which boasts the world's highest economic growth rate, thus belying the basic assumptions of the neoliberal ideology that has held sway across the globe for more than 30 years now. The fact is that China, which is when you say East Asia, it's basically China, given its size, China can in no sense be cited to illustrate the success of the export-oriented market economy model. As was recently pointed out in a special report on the Chinese economy in a publication that cannot be suspected of being critical of neoliberalism, which is The Economist, and I'm reading here, it is investment, not exports, that leads China's economy. Spending on plant machinery, buildings, and infrastructure accounted for about 48% of China's GDP in 2011. Now, a disproportionate share of China's investment, says the same report, is made by state-owned enterprises and in recent years by infrastructure ventures under the control of provincial or municipal authorities, but not on their balance sheets. Now, South Asia, which here is the red line, and here again it's mostly one country, India, by far the dominant economy in the group, is usually held up with much greater justification, actually, than China from this standpoint, as an evidence of the success of the neoliberal model, since it has been posting high rates of economic growth in the last few years, despite the contraction that we can see here in the state's economic role. Now, the reason for this growth is that in India, private fixed investment has replaced public investment. The ratio of private investment to GDP very much exceeds that of MENA's. So private investment, as for East Asia, in contrast, it has suffered from the crisis that affected the region, the 97 crisis in East Asia, with the result that until 2004, the rate of private investment in East Asia has been lower than even in MENA, and started catching up later and went beyond MENA. So you see that on both sides, public and private, MENA is poorly located. The relative, the result of what we have seen is that the relative leveling off or decline in MENA's public investment that we have seen as a result of the changes starting in the 70s has not been offset, like it has been more or less in India, by an increase in private investment. The private sector's contribution to gross fixed capital formation in MENA countries except for, I mean, because of the figures we have from the World Bank. So the GCC countries, the Gulf Cooperation Council monarchies are not included, but the contribution basically stagnated between 82 and 2007, the period for which figures are available. And it fluctuated within a narrow range of between 12 to 16%, and whereas in contrast, they rose almost uninterruptedly in South Asia, climbing from nearly 9%, from only 9% of GDP in 82 to 23% in 2007 before the international economic crisis. So this ratio is nearly 50% higher than that of MENA. And as for East Asia, as I said, it caught up later on and reached 22%, quite, I mean, higher than even what you have in the Middle East and North Africa. Syria provides a good illustration of everything that have just been said. Accelerated liberalization of the economy under Bashar al-Assad in the 2000s has brought on a record fall in the rate of public investment from 13% of GDP in 2005 to 8% in 2008. Whereas the rate of private investment that were supposed to make up for the decline, according to the doctrine, the decline in public effort, has stagnated at 11, 12%. So consequently, the overall state rate of investment in the country dipped from 25% to 20% of GDP. Whereas, therefore, the industrial public sector languished for lack of private buyers at the same time. Egypt is another illustration of what I'm saying. You see how I mean, the parallel between the decline in public investment and total investment. Private investment is not offsetting the decline of public investment, and even though you had in the 2000s for a short while, widening gap, as I was explaining to my students this morning, this is just the effect of the spillover of the glut in oil money due to the increase in oil prices and therefore some capital coming from Gulf countries, but usually in sectors which are not conducive to anything that may solve the economic problem that we have seen, and especially that of unemployment, most of the case speculative type, real estate, and the rest. So to sum up all that, while it is true that the Arab states are far from fully complying with the neoliberal model, that's undisputable, the fact is that this model, this neoliberal model, whatever one thinks of the ethical values on which it is predicated, because one thing is to reject it from an ethical point of view as something, I mean, deeply unjust kind of model. Another thing is to dispute its performance. So here the discussion is still on. As you know, because we're living in such a place, European governments, the only way European governments are seeing out of the present crisis is by further neoliberalization of the economies. So my contention here is, for the region we are discussing, and I'll be categorical about that, this model cannot work. It cannot provide any solution. A number of structural, social, and political factors that I don't have time to develop, and that would be, I'm afraid that I'm maybe a little bit too long already, but I analyze all that in details in my book for those who are interested. A number of structural factors constrain the ability of such a model even to function and to work in the region, let alone being applied. Economic and social policies inspired by the neoliberal paradigm have thus unquestionably played a major part, and again, I'm not saying that it's not the case, in precipitating the regional uprising by exacerbating corruption on the highest rung of the social ladder, while simultaneously producing disastrous results for the social strata on the bottom rungs. These policies have very obviously touched off the explosion. That's absolutely clear. Yet the way they have been implemented in the Arab countries has been determined in both its modalities and effects by the social political character of the regimes in place there. The fact that the new regimes emerging from the Arab uprising to this day are all committed to the same neoliberal prescriptions that the international financial institutions keep advocating for the region. And by the way, Egypt signed just yesterday the loan agreement with the IMF, which is the kind of green light for further, or supposed to be, for further FDI in Egypt. And we can see, we can read we're quite accustomed to what we'll be reading as the conditionalities of this. No surprise, fiscal consolidation is a key pillar, it is said, of this economic program, but at the same time we learn that the top tax rate will not change. And focus on cutting fuel subsidies, which is just unleashing uprising in Jordan over the last few days. Monetary and exchange rate policies will be geared towards ensuring declining inflation, the same monetarist neoliberal kind of frame. And of course, enhancing Egypt's international competitiveness, for what this might mean, to stimulate trade and attract capital inflows. Same recipes, and therefore, you can be sure, same results, even worse actually, because of the instability itself created by the uprising, which is very much worsening the conditions that already produced the result that we are discussing. So the fact that the new regimes, the new governments emerging now are committed to these prescriptions means that we are only at the initial phase of what will certainly be a long-term revolutionary process. The crisis will not be solved short of profound changes in the social structure of the countries in the region, underlying a radical turn in social and economic policies. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. Denise, it's up to you, and thank you very much for coming.
The lights seem to have come on all of a sudden. It gives me great pleasure to be given this opportunity to participate in this celebration of the work and contributions of my colleague and friend, Professor Gilbert Achcar. When I first read his major work, Les Arabes et la Shoah, which was published in English as The Arabs and the Holocaust, it became immediately clear to me that Gilbert was not a crowd pleaser, but someone who had the courage to take the risks that intellectual integrity demands. His writing offers comfort neither to Zionists, whose propaganda foils he meticulously dismantles, nor to the currents of thought in the Arab world subscribing to Holocaust denial or latent or overt anti-Semitism. His is a humanistic voice that insists that such voices do, did, and can exist in the Arab world. And this, at a perilous time when the politics of the region is dominated by the religious right, whether in Israel that justifies colonial territorial expansion as a divine right, or among the wagers of jihad against the infidel. Gilbert's insistence on working on a complex historical canvas and refusing to simplify it, eschewing the easy comforts of conventional wisdoms, and refuting the facile logic of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, is the hallmark of his scholarship, whether he's dealing with geopolitics and international relations or with Middle East politics. Luckily for SOAS, Gilbert took on the role of founding chairs of the Center of Palestinian Studies, which was launched under the auspices of the LMEI in March 2012, catalyzing our important pool of interdisciplinary expertise with 35 members of staff and 18 PhD students, probably the most significant critical mass in the field of Palestinian studies in the UK, if not in the whole of Europe. Gilbert is a scholar whose international stature transcends the narrow confines of REFs, TQAs, and the sundry acronyms that now dominate our academic life. Whether one is in agreement with him or not, he reminds us of what it means to be a public intellectual, writing in a lucid, jargon-free style in a profession where we sometimes forget that writing and speaking are about communicating and projecting our ideas. Glancing through his CV, I am struck by the fact that no sooner do his books hit the press that they are translated into multiple languages, not just the obvious English and Arabic, since his original texts tend to be in French, but German, Italian, Spanish, Turkish, Greek, Korean, and I could go on. I believe that the first edition of his acclaimed book, The Clash of Barbarisms, broke records in this respect by also including Chinese, Taiwanese, and Hindi, a global readership most of us can only dream of. What is even more remarkable is that Gilbert's prodigious output of monographs has, if anything, gathered pace since he joined SOAS in 2007, a miraculous, but I am sure utterly exhausting endeavor. I had the privilege of being his next-door neighbor when he joined SOAS as I was reaching my retirement and handed over to him my role as research tutor. I walked into his office carrying piles of PhD applications, an experience that must have been initially hard to digest with his European background, since he was as yet innocent of the serious amounts of academic-related administration we routinely carry out at SOAS. Yet even that could not break his momentum. While we're on the subject of offices, my own, which had up to that moment seemed fairly cozy, was revealed as a total mess in comparison to the neat and methodical manner in which Gilbert had arranged his space. A rigor and method I would discover in time was entirely reflected in his scholarship and his thought processes. However, his engagement with the world of politics and ideas does not prevent him from being an avid world traveler, a gourmet, an outstanding cook, and a gracious host, making me wonder at times whether he's in possession of a secret formula that extends his days beyond the mere 24 hours that common mortals are restricted to. Gilbert brought the Department of Development Studies not only a missing and much needed specialism in the Middle East, but a touch of glamour. The globalization seminars he initiated as coordinator of our then new MSc in Globalization Studies and Globalization and Development turned into high-profile public events where our students were finally able to hear and meet celebrities who are no longer names on library shelves. Gilbert now acts as a magnet for international research students who are keen to work under his guidance. I believe he had 14 at the last count. I can fully understand why. Please join me in thanking Professor Gilbert Achcar, a scholar and a gentleman.